Hi, I want to welcome you and thank you for streaming this message today. I'm really glad that you joined us. At Bailey Christian Church, it matters to us that you feel welcomed, like that this is family. Whether you're young or not so young, my hope is that you'll encounter Jesus, and that as you encounter Jesus, you'll find encouragement to live a life of faith for Him. If you're new with us today, I would love if you wouldn't mind filling out the Connect card that is linked here, or going to baileychristianchurch.com and letting us know who you are, if you have any questions that we can follow up with, or even if you have a prayer concern and you'd like somebody to pray for you, we'd love to know so that we can connect with you. If you're in the area sometime, in the Bailey area, we'd love to have you join us in person. And the reason I invite you into that is because we're called not just to experience a message, but actually to live a life of faith in the context of community. And so we'd love for you to be a part of what's happening here at Bailey. And if you want to know more about how you can get plugged in to what's happening here, again, go back to baileychristianchurch.com, check things out, and if we can help you, we would love to follow up with you as well. I hope today that you're blessed through this message. Well, we've covered Genesis. We're into Exodus now. We're already into the second book of the Bible. And by the way, if you haven't picked up one of the bookmarks out there that has the books of the Bible, if that's helpful for you, I want to encourage you not only to kind of follow along so you can tell the story, also to work on some of the memory verses that we'll have on a monthly basis, but also to work on the books of the Bible. I mean, I know it's really kind of foundational stuff, but to be honest with you, a lot of us may have learned some of that when we were kids and have forgotten it since then. Some of us never really picked up on that stuff. And so this is just a good way of helping us kind of put pegs on the wall to be able to hang the pieces of the story to help us understand how the Bible flows. Well, let's start in Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to read just a couple of verses here to kind of set the background for us. Remember, Joseph and his family have all moved to Egypt. Joseph was put in a place of power just beneath the king, just beneath Pharaoh, in order to spare the people through the famine. But it also meant drawing all of God's people, the family of Israel, the family of Jacob, into Egypt. And so look at verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And with that verse, we skip about 400 years ahead. Now, I want to highlight that because it's so easy to flip from page to page and think, that Moses and Jesus are neighbors. I mean, there's a lot of time, and sometimes it's really literally a matter of a chapter or a page. But here's the thing. God is the author of this story, and He's not in a hurry, which should give us some patience in a very hurried culture, that God's not rushing this thing. But it also is a reminder that when you think of miraculous things, and we'll see miraculous things in the book of Exodus, miraculous things aren't happening on every page of the Bible. Because sometimes we can read the Bible and go, oh, I want that, I want this. I want you to understand that it's not like every one of God's generation, every one of God's people in each generation had the same experience. Often they did not. But there were moments in which God broke in and did significant things.
But let me give you a little bit more background as we move to, we're going to get to chapters 3 and 4, but I want to give you a little coverage of chapters 1 and 2 first. The first thing is this, that as God's people are growing, the Pharaoh of Egypt is nervous. And there's a new Pharaoh that rises up that doesn't know Joseph, doesn't really know their family, and so he puts them into slavery. Because he's afraid that if they become too numerous, they might actually revolt and come against Egypt. Because of this, as they continue to grow, there's a plot to kill the Israelite baby boys. The Pharaoh believes that maybe the way he can kind of nip this in the bud is to start taking out the baby boys. Infanticide. Now I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but what I want you to highlight, I want to highlight something. You're going to see a continuing theme that goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Look at your insert here. Life, multiplying, and the filling of the earth. Remember Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God blesses humanity, and he says, be fruitful and increase and fill the earth. What does this say that God's people are actually doing? They're being fruitful, they're increasing, and they're multiplying. They're actually fulfilling God's commandment to them, to humanity, to fill the earth. But I also want you to note something, and I think it's significant in our day and age, is Satan's desire to wipe out God's people and to thwart his plans for salvation. Now, you're not going to see the name Satan in here. In fact, in the Old Testament, there's not a lot of discussion about the devil. It's fairly limited. You see that develop as we come into the New Testament. But Satan and his minions have an anti-life view. His agents continue to have ways of trying to decrease humanity, to try to decrease particularly God's people, which I think is a good word for us today. Because I think that any view that belittles life, and any view that sees life as inconvenient or overcrowding, we're afraid of overcrowding, is not from God, is from hell. And so I think that even here in Exodus, we have a shout out to life, that God is life. In fact, one of the key reasons for judgment coming on Egypt will be their view of anti-life and taking out of God's people. Well, chapter 2, Moses is spared. Moses, in the midst of these children being killed, he is set aside as a special one, and God has plans for Moses. He ends up being raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. He's raised in the household of Pharaoh. It's an amazing story. I encourage you to read it. Well, he gets to about 40. And he has this sense that he is a deliverer of God's people. I don't know exactly how that happens, but he's communicated with his family. His mom actually ends up having a connection and raising him and so forth. And so he has his foot in both camps. He knows he's Hebrew, he knows he's Israelite, and he's also being raised in the Pharaoh's court. And one day he sees a fellow Israelite being abused by a slave master. He takes a look around and he raises up and he kills the Egyptian. Well, he thinks he's done a noble thing, only to find out the next day that word has gotten out. And he knows his neck is on the line, and so he flees. And so now, in one chapter, we now move 40 years ahead. So now, in a few chapters, we're 80 years. And now, in chapter 3, verse 1, we pick up our story. It's taken 80 years before Moses can be the leader that God has called him to be. And now Moses, verse 1, was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. He's moved from Pharaoh's court to being a shepherd. And Jethro was the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I will go over and I will see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. So we're going to break this longer passage up. And so take a look at your insert following along here. Essentially, God gets Moses' attention with this simple but profound act of this burning bush that doesn't ultimately burn. It's a miracle. In theology, it's known as a theophany. That is, theos meaning God, that God makes himself present in some way that people can engage with him. And so in this sense, he calls out to Moses from this bush that doesn't burn, which also is an indicator about the reason for miracles. The reason for miracles are known often as signs and wonders. They're to grab attention. They're not just to be it's not a traveling magic show. It's in order for God to get the attention of his people and of the world. But I want you to notice something else here, is how God uses ordinary things and ordinary people to do his will. I think of the bush. Just a simple bush. Nothing of significance there, but God shows up and he's present. In fact, we'll see in a moment that land there becomes holy. But not only that, the word Horeb means wasteland. God shows up in the wasteland, in the wilderness. And not to Pharaoh, but now to a shepherd. Now Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house, but here he's a shepherd. And isn't it interesting? God shows up and reveals himself out in the wilderness to a shepherd. Well, it won't be the last time. He'll also make himself known in other times and in other seasons to shepherds out in the wilderness. And so we're reminded of how God uses simple things and simple people to do his will. Look at verse 4. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." And what we see here, and this is on your insert, is that God initiates relationship. God draws Moses in. And that's a theme throughout the Bible. Remember back in Genesis, after Adam and Eve sin, and Adam and Eve have fled out, they've run away from God, they're hiding, and God calls to Adam and Eve to draw them out. God chooses Abraham, and he calls Abraham out. God initiates the relationship. In fact, in 1 John, John tells us we love because he first loved us, because God first loved us. So God initiates relationship, and that's so significant for us as humans. We wonder where God is in the midst of things, that God really is initiating. He's desiring a relationship with us. He's not in hiding. Let's go down to verse 5 then. And so now that Moses has come close, he says, "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying, and because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their sufferings. And so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and a spacious land." The idea of land, remember we talked about last week, is an important theme. God has promised a land to his people, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Well, there's an awful lot packed into these verses, and so let's kind of unpack them together. We see here a view to holiness, of introductions. God here introduces himself to Moses, and also the reasons for the calling. And in all of this, we're going to see something specifically about God. And the first thing is this is on your insert, that God is holy. That God is holy, and that Moses, rather, is called then to respect and to honor and to understand the awesomeness of God. But what does holy mean? Now, we use the term holy usually today as kind of a sarcastic comment. Well, you think you're holier than thou, you're better than me kind of thing. And somehow as being as if you're walking on water. Well, holy, it really carries the idea of being set apart. In fact, this piece of land is not holy in and of itself. It's holy, one, because God is there, and because it's been set apart for this purpose of Moses encountering God. And so Moses is learning a lesson very quickly that God is awesome and that he's to be respected. And holiness is going to be a really important theme in the Bible. Now, we'll keep that holiness image in your mind in a moment. We'll come back to it on how God comes near as well. But the idea of holiness and of taking off your sandals is still a practice in certain cultures. In fact, in India, when you come into the church, you're taking off your shoes or your sandals. When you're in Middle East at times, even in Muslim cultures, they'll take off their shoes before they enter into their mosques. So the idea of honoring the holiness of God and taking off your shoes is carried on even to today. And so he's teaching Moses a lesson. He's giving him boundaries. He's letting him know that God is set apart. But he's also, I think, helping him realize that Moses also will then be set apart. He will be marked as holy, as a bearer of the holiness of God to other people, and he'll be set apart for a special purpose. The second thing we see about God is not only that he's holy, but even though he's holy and set apart, he's also personal. It's interesting because he introduces himself. He says, oh, by the way, I'm the God of your fathers. I'm God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He's part of their family story. Now, you have to understand, I don't know to what extent God's people during their time in bondage in Egypt understood who God was. I'm sure they told some of the stories of their family and things that God had done, but they didn't have an awful lot of personal interaction with him at this point. They were just stories for the most part. And so God is now re-entering in, and he is personal. I'm a part of your story. Thirdly, we see that God identifies with suffering. God identifies with the suffering. Not only is holy, he's personal, but he comes to Moses to say, the reason I'm responding is because my people are hurting. The cries of their suffering have risen to my ears. Now, you have to understand, those are ways of God describing. It's not as if God wasn't aware until they cried out to him, but he's saying, I have been fully aware of what's going on, and enough is enough. He has an intimate experience with their suffering. How many of us have been through a really rough spell and found ourselves going, God, where are you? Where are you when the light, when the world is turned upside down, when my life is turned crazy? And I think the story of God's people and the story of Moses and the story of deliverance is that God is near. That God is intimately aware, and that he does care. It may feel like he's at a distance, and I understand that, especially when we feel very much alone. But the reality is that God is far closer than we realize. And he will call his people to be like him. In fact, what's interesting is this very story of his delivering them out of suffering and out of bondage, he will call them to remember, you were in bondage. And you were set free. You are to treat other foreigners, you're to treat others who are hurting in the same way as I'm treating you. You're to love and care for them as well. Which leads me to the last part of what we see about God here, is that God comes near. He doesn't stay at a distance. Yes, he's holy, and he is other than us. He's creator, God, and yet he comes near. He doesn't choose to stay at a distance, but comes to enter into the world. Well, let's look at verse 10. Now we get to the calling. So now go, God says. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So simply put, Moses' calling here is to go. He's to be the deliverer. He's to be the one that is the spokesperson for God and for his people. Verse 11. Now the debate begins, the protesting begins. Moses is in the presence of God, and he's, here I am. But look what he says next. But Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Terence Fredheim says, Moses' here I am quickly becomes who am I? And so Moses' first protest is, who am I? You sure you got the right guy? Me? It must have been difficult because at one point I think he thought he was the deliverer. He raised up He rose up at the right time to deliver what he thought was the right thing to do in standing up for his fellow Israelites, only to find out that got him in trouble, and so he fled for 40 years. He's a little insecure. And so, go down to verse 12. And God said, God's answer to him is, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses says, who am I? And God's answer, take a look, answer number one is, it doesn't matter, Moses. I'll be with you. It's not about who you are. It's about who I am. Now, what's interesting is that he says, oh, by the way, you'll know that this is really true, and here's the sign. That after you've done all this work and delivered the people, you will come and you will worship me on this mountain. Now, take a look at your insert. The sign won't be clear until after the Exodus. That's a little late. I kind of like to know a little bit more in advance of this. So I want you to kind of reflect on this a little bit with me. In other words, Moses, you are not going to know all of that. You're going to have to trust me. And so here's what God promises. God promises his presence. He said, I'm not going to spell all of that out for you. I'm going to tell you, you'll know at this point, but in between now and then, you're going to have to trust me. I think that's what scares the daylights out of us. I want to know. But this is the most important part for Moses and for us to know, is that God will be with us. Some of you may be familiar with the evangelist and preacher Louis Palau. Maybe not, but he's well known around the world as an evangelist. He tells some of his early stories. He said, during my first semester at Multnomah School of the Bible, Torchbearers Ministry founder, Major Ian Thomas, spoke at our chapel service. He talked about how it took Moses 40 years in the wilderness to learn that he was nothing. And then one day, Moses was confronted with a burning bush, likely a dry bunch of ugly sticks. Yet Moses had to take off his sandals. Why? Because God was in the bush. Major Thomas said, God was telling Moses, I don't need a pretty bush or an educated bush or an eloquent bush. Any old bush will do as long as I'm in the bush. If I'm going to use you, it won't be you doing something for me, but me doing something through you. And it was that kind of bush, a useless bunch of dried up sticks. He says, Palau says, I was that kind of bush. I could do nothing for God. All my reading and studying and modeling myself after others was worthless unless God was in the bush. Only he could make something happen. And so when Thomas closed his message, I ran back to my room, and in tears I prayed in my native Spanish. My spiritual struggle was finally over. I'd let God be God and let Louis be dependent on him. And that was the lesson Moses was going to learn. In fact, that's the lesson God's people were called to learn. That's the lesson we're called to learn. Final note before we move on to the next part of the passage. In my reading, somebody pointed this out. I think it was a really good point. It's on your insert, is that Israel will be set free to worship. Notice that the first sign that Moses will get that all of this is part of God's plan is that Israel gets to worship freely. Just kind of let that sink in. Maybe let that stick in your mind for the next week or so. He set his people free to worship. They were in bondage and weren't able to worship God in the way that he had intended. He hadn't even explained that to them yet. But now they've been set free, and they've been set free to worship. Maybe that's true for us too. We're called to worship as we've been set free. Verse 13. And Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? So here's protest number 2. Who are you? It's who am I? And now it's who are you? You see, Moses is not finished. He knows that the Israelites are going to ask him a little bit more about this God. I understand they may have heard stories about God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they didn't know him. intimately. And so they want to know just exactly what kind of God this is. You have to understand, they have been for 400-ish years in Egypt, which is polytheistic, all different kinds of gods, all different kinds of idols. And so they don't really know a lot yet. And so he's wondering, who exactly are you? And so verse 14, God responds. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is one of the most important passages in the Bible. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Answer number 2, God says, I am who I am. There's a lot here that more than we're going to be able to unpack, but let me give you at least a sketch of what's happening here. Number 1 is that God reveals himself by name. He hadn't revealed himself in this way up to this point. And so God is making himself known. You ever been in a setting and maybe it's when you're younger and there's a particular girl you really like or a guy that you really are attracted to, but you don't know who they are. And then you find out their name. Monica. And then you start to put an image of the name, not the name exactly what it means, but just the person that is now attached to the name. And so now you're writing it on your notebook for the next month and a half, and Darren Hart's Monica. I never really dated a Monica or anything, but just thought it was a good name anyway. But somehow when we know somebody's name, we feel like we know something about them, and especially when they're asking about God, they want to know more about who he is, what kind of God he is. And so in doing so, God reveals an awful lot here. He says, I am who I am. Now, it can also be translated, I will be who I will be. God always has been, he always will be. He is the God who is always present. In fact, in your English translations, often he'll go on to say, in fact, take a look back here. I'll give you an indication here. Verse 15, where it says, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers. That word Lord, in many translations, now some of the newer ones may not do this, but many of the translations in English will capitalize this word, L-O-R-D. If it's in lowercase, it's a different word. Lord, capital L, smaller case, O-R-D. That smaller one is Adonai. The capital one is Yahweh. And it's from the verb, it's probably taken from the verb to be. And so this idea of I am who I am is kind of drawn out in his name, Yahweh, is that this is the God who always is. And by the way, this is in your insert. It would be Yahweh and not Jehovah. Jehovah is not really how that would have been pronounced. Actually, to be honest, we don't know exactly how it would be pronounced. I think Yahweh is the closest to that. I say it's not Jehovah because they didn't have a letter J like that in Hebrew. But the reason we don't know exactly is because after the Old Testament time, leading into Jesus' time, the Jews were not pronouncing Jesus' name. Or not pronouncing Yahweh, rather. They didn't want to take God's name in vain, and so they would insert Adonai as a way of referring to Lord, but they didn't want to say his name and take it. They wanted to revere his name and keep it holy, and so they wouldn't even say his name. And so we don't know actually how it's pronounced, but we know that this is what God has said to reveal himself. Now let's unpack a little bit more about what he's saying. When he says, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, Terence Fredheim, an Old Testament scholar, says, the force is not simply that God is or that God is present, but that God will be faithfully God for them. God will be God with and for the people at all times and places. He will be God for them. Another person points this out, that Hebrew here seeks the significance or the character, the quality, the interpretation of the name. Therefore, what they needed to know was, what does that name mean or signify in circumstances such as we? And okay, so you're God. What kind of God are you? What are you like? And so this was to be his name forever. His name was his person, his character, his authority, his power, and his reputation. So, by the way, when Jesus says, when you pray anything in my name, it's not a magical way of saying Jesus' name. It's a way of praying in his character, in the very person of Jesus. It represents far more than just words on a page. But here's what I want to draw your attention to back on your insert. Is that what God does here is that God makes himself vulnerable. When he shares his name, he's open to acceptance or rejection. Now, God doesn't make himself any less God, but when he comes near to humanity and he reveals himself, just as you reveal yourself to somebody else, you run the risk of being rejected or accepted. And so God enters into a real relationship with humanity. As Fredheim goes on to say, anyone whose name is known becomes part of the community that has names. And God has entered into community with his people. Well, then in the next few verses, God tells him to go back to share with Israel that he's going to deliver them, to go to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh's not going to listen, but in the end that God will take his people out. Now I'll go to chapter 4, verse 1. The conversation isn't over yet. You'd think, hey, that's enough. But in verse 1, Moses protests another time. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and they say the Lord did not really appear to you? So protest number 3 is, what if they don't believe me? Now God is being told, is this really enough? Because they're going to say, sure you had this experience, burning bush, really? But I want you to notice something, that this is real dialogue. God is not giving up on Moses in the midst of this conversation. And God's not afraid of our frustration or our questions. He's still engaged in this. And so look at verse 2. Then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. And so his answer is, what's that in your hand? Something basic. And so God gives Moses 3 signs. One is he throws the staff down and the staff becomes a serpent, and Moses runs away from it, and he takes it by the tail, and it becomes a staff again. That'll prepare him to encounter the magicians in Pharaoh's court. He said, well, if that's not enough, and so God tells him to put his hand in his cloak, and he pulls it out, and it says it's leprosy. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean of what we just think of leprosy, but lots of different kind of skin disorders. And then he puts it back in, and he pulls it out. That must have been shocking, but then it was back to normal. It was healed. And then he says, if they don't believe those, then take some water and pour it on the ground, and it will become blood, which is an indication of one of the first plagues that will happen. And so he gives them 3 signs. But here's what's significant. Take a look at your insert again. The staff, then he tells them, I want you to take the staff, because the staff now has become the staff of God. That is an extension of the hand of God at work. It's not a magical staff. It is a sense of a visible presence of God, and it will be the power of God that does this. And so this is done to help give Moses confidence, but also the Israelites, that this is really God at work. Now, verse 10. And Moses said to the Lord, pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Protest number 4. I don't speak so good. Now, it may be that he had a stutter, but some scholars indicate not so much that he has a stutter or a speech impediment, but that he just complained that I'm not eloquent, I'm not quick-witted enough to respond to the Pharaoh. He's insecure. I'm in over my depth here. Well, how about you? Has that ever been your response to God? Me? I don't. You could really use me. Do you see how I fumbled that last week? And I'm stuttering. I can't get my thoughts right. The sin in my past. All these kind of things. I want you to remember, what has Moses already done? He's murdered a guy. So maybe he can use you too. My guess is that's not in your past. though there may be surely other things there, I want you to realize that God is able to use the person that allows himself or herself to be used. In fact, I love the story the comment that Dwight L. Moody, another famous evangelist from the 1800s, said, "I know perfectly well that wherever I go and preach, there are many better preachers known and heard than I am, and all that I can say about it is that the Lord uses me." It's amazing what God will do when we just simply surrender. Verse 11. The Lord said to him, "Who gave humans their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? If it is not I, the Lord. Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." So what's God's answer to him? Who's God? Who's God? In other words, who makes humans? Who's in charge? Who has the power? And he's trying to declare very clearly, I'm in charge of that. 13. Now we get to the heart of things. But Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send somebody else." Protest number 5. I don't want to go. I really don't want to go, God. In fact, now I think we're getting to the heart of the matter. For how many of you are the excuses really a way of subtly saying, "God, I really just don't want to"? It's not just because I'm weak or I'm insecure or anything. I don't want to. And so I want to invite you to kind of take a closer look at and examine your own motives and say, maybe that's the heart of it. God, I just don't really want to do what you want me to do, and I'll throw up other excuses, but the heart of it is I just don't want to. Now here's what's amazing. Look at verse 14, and this will be to the end of the passage here. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you." So God is showing his ability to know things beyond Moses. "You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it." Answer number 5, plan B. This wasn't God's initial intention. God had desires and plans for Moses. But go to your insert. There's some things I want to draw out here as we come to a close. I want you to notice, first of all, God's willingness to work with Moses. He said, "No, you're the guy." So what's interesting is that we're not erased in our relationship with God. God may very well have intentions. But if it's a genuine relationship, then we have say in it, whether to obey or not to obey. Now, I want you to understand that this doesn't mean that God is always happy about our responses, but that he can still work with us despite our objections at times. This is a real relationship. Now, here's why this is important. Because some of you are middle-aged or beyond. Yeah, you're probably not going to live to be 110. So, and have said, I missed my calling. And the assumption with that is that therefore God can't use me. Really? I should have turned left when I turned right back in my 20s, and so what's the point now? How old's Moses? He's 80. He sort of blew it back when he was 40. He's kind of blowing it now. But the reason I say that is because sometimes we have this image that God has this perfect map mapped out for us, and that if I don't get everything just right, then I will have blown it. And I'll show up on Judgment Day, and God will go, "Well, here's what I wanted, and look at all this." Well, I'm sorry. Now, I'm not saying God doesn't have plans for our lives. I'm just saying that God is bigger than this kind of wooden, literalistic kind of thing. He's actually working with us even when we zig when we should have zagged. He says, "I'm not done with you." In fact, that's what forgiveness is about. That's what this journey is about. In fact, we're learning, even when we stumble, that we can come back and learn, and God might use that stumbling in ways that we would never have imagined. In fact, it becomes part of our story too. It's not an excuse to sin or to disobey. I just want you to know God's not done with you, even if you blew it at some point. And some of you need to know that. Because I'm confident that some of you said, well, there's what's left for me. And I just want to let you know that God's not done. Any dry bush will do if God is in it. The presence of God is what Moses needed most. The presence of God is what you and I need most too. More than a miracle, more than answered prayer, more than the things going the way that we hoped they would, that God says, let me be enough, and then I will direct the rest. Well, I want to flash forward to Jesus. One day, Jesus is having a debate with the Jewish leaders. They're not happy with Jesus. In fact, Jesus kind of ticked them off because he told them that they were like spawn of Satan, which is always, words that are real affirming. And he said, "You're sons and daughters of Satan." And they go, "What do you mean?" "No, we're children of Abraham." And he goes, "It's not what Abraham says." He goes, "What do you mean? What do you know what Abraham says?" And look what he says in verse 8, John 8:58. "Very truly, I tell you," Jesus answered, "before Abraham was born, I am." And at this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Why would they try to stone him for those words? Maybe it's those two simple words right in the middle of that. Before Abraham was born, I am. How did God reveal himself to Moses? I am. Is it possible that the Jewish leaders were picking up what Jesus was laying down, and he was equating himself with the God of all creation, the eternal God, and saying, I know Abraham because I saw him before you were born. I was the creator of all the universe. I am. And so what the story of Jesus tells us is that God doesn't just sit off at a distance and he doesn't just answer prayer, that God enters into our history and into our world and says, I will carry your suffering. And I will be the God who will be the God who you need to be in this moment. I am God, always have been, always will be. And I have entered in to carry the pain and the suffering for my people. When you take a look at all the foreign religions around the world, you'll not see that. God entering in and carrying the pain of his people is what makes Jesus so unique in all of history. Not only the very eternal God, but the very, very real human coming and bearing our sin and our suffering. So when you ever wonder where God is in the midst of your suffering, you need only look to the cross and you say he's right there with us. This morning as we come to communion, it is the sign on a weekly basis of the presence of God with us. It's a reminder of what he's done for us. And so I want to invite us to think about and reflect on the very real presence of God with us today, not just in the story of Moses, not just in Jesus at the cross, but here with us today. And we're a people of God, and the Spirit of God dwells within us. And so if you're a Christian, you don't have to be a member here, but if you're a Christian, you're welcome to partake with us. After I pray, I want to invite you to go back to one of the tables and grab the communion cups and take some time with the eternal God who is present with us in his Son. Let's pray. Jesus, we give you all the praise. And all of the things that are true of the Father, all the things that are true of God are true of you. That you are eternal, that you are God the Son come down to where we're at. to bear our suffering, to bear our sin, and to remind us that if we ever wonder where you are at in the midst of our trials and struggles, we need only look to the cross. And so we thank you today. We just want you to know we need you. Thank you for not being far off. May we, even right now, Lord, have a very strong sense, a very real sense of your presence as we encounter your broken body and your spilt blood. And may we walk away today carrying that presence very strongly with us. That when people look to us and see us and encounter us, they'll begin to see you more clearly as well. It's in your name we pray. Amen.